Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight with Curtis Chin discussing his award-winning memoir, Everything I Learned. Come on in. Everything I learned in a Chinese food restaurant. And since we're a small group, if you don't mind kind of moving in so that it can feel a little bit more intimate in terms of conversation, that would be terrific. I'm Dr. Nancy Beck-Young, the director of the Center for Public History and a professor in the UH History Department. We are so glad to have you here with us tonight. At the Center for Public History, our vision is to ignite an understanding of our diverse pasts by collaborating with and training historically minded students, practitioners, and the public through community-driven programming and scholarship. One of the ways that we do this is through the CPH Lecture Series, which provides funding for unique opportunities like this panel discussion for scholars, professionals, community leaders, artists, and others to consider humanities perspectives directly related to the decisions they make. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce our two UH professors who are on the panel. First, Dr. Melody Lee, who is the coordinator for the event and is the person who brought us tonight's wonderful event. Melody is an associate professor of Chinese studies at the University of Houston and a distinguished scholar of Asian diaspora literature, migration studies, and transnational cultural identity. Her interdisciplinary research examines how contemporary Chinese diasporic communities navigate belonging, memory, and cultural performance across borders, with particular focus on the intersection of literature, performing arts, translation, and cultural studies. Among her current research projects is the newly launched Digital Humanities Project, Mapping Houston's Old Chinatown, an online site with interactive maps, oral histories, and archival research that documents the close-knit Pan-Asian community across Houston's East downtown during the 1950s to the 2000s. We are very happy to have Melody as a CPH affiliate and for her project to be a part of the stable of CPH's public-facing projects. Let me also provide a quick introduction to our other guest panelist from UH for the evening, Dr. Todd Romero. Todd is a longtime colleague and friend of the Center for Public History. He is an associate professor of history in the UH History Department, and he is also associate dean of undergraduate studies in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. He researches and teaches classes on early American, Native American, public, and food history. Having grown up in a restaurant setting, Todd has a personal and scholarly interest in researching the history and culture of various foodways traditions, and I know he's excited to be here tonight to discuss Curtis Chin's memoir. And now I'll give the floor over to Dr. Lee to introduce our honored guest speaker for tonight. Melody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young, for your wonderful and generous introduction. I always feel very pressured whenever someone introduces you so nicely, right? You have to live up to it. I hope you all had dinner. What a great time to have a dinner talk on food, right? So you can be staffing and think about food. Welcome, everyone. We are very honored to host Curtis Chin today, but I'm not going to read a 20-page biography. Please visit his website. And today we are going to talk about his award-winning memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. Of course, I am tasked to do some marketing. So if you haven't got a copy, there's you can purchase a copy outside and get his autograph later. He's the co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York City, and Curtis Chin served as the nonprofit's first executive director. He went on to write comedy for network and cable television before transitioning to social justice documentaries. Chin has screened his films at over 600 venues in 20 countries. He has written for CNN, Bon Appetit, the Detroit Free Press, and the Emancipator and Boston Globe. A graduate of the University of Michigan, Chin has received awards from ABC, Disney Television, New York Foundation for the Arts, National Endowment for the Arts, and more. His essay in Bon Appetit was just selected for Best Food Writing in America 2023, and his short documentary, Dear Corky, premiere on American Masters, PBS. He's currently working on a new Chinese restaurant project. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to him about his best-selling memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. As a scholar of Chinese diaspora engaged in a public history project uncovering Houston's old Chinatown, I have found his memoir to be deeply insightful. This memoir weaves together humor, identity, and community to tell a deeply resonant Chinese-American story. We'll begin with some questions from Dr. Romero and I before opening the floor. Could we please invite and give a warm Houston welcome to Curtis?
I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, but I like to think of it as not just any Chinese restaurant, I like to think of it as the Chinese restaurant in Detroit. And the way I sort of gauge that is I start by asking people to guess how many egg rolls you think we sold in the 65 years that my family owned this business. Any guess?
2 million.
I'm sorry, what did you say? 2 million? Okay.
I was going to guess 200,000.
200,000? Any other guesses? We actually sold over 10 million egg rolls, all made by my grandmother, my mom, and my auntie. So it's like a really great place to grow up because it had the best Chinese food. But despite the fact that our city of hometown of Detroit was going through a lot of difficulties in the 80s, the auto industry was struggling, there was crack cocaine, there was AIDS. I actually knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. But despite that, you know, we had this magical Chinese restaurant in the inner city of Detroit where my parents were able to raise me and my 5 siblings. And so for me, writing this book is partially a thank you to them, you know, for providing us with all the life lessons we needed to sort of get on with our lives. But it's also, you know, a hat tip to my hometown of Detroit because I think a lot of people still kind of misunderstand the city. And I wanted to show that Detroit was still capable of producing good things, like me. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to just read a little bit from the prologue and then we'll engage in our conversation. Sound good? Okay, so the book is divided into 3 different sections of 888 because that's good luck to Chinese people. But I wanted to start the prologue specifically talking about my family and their journey to Michigan. And there's a couple reasons for that. Is that first, you know, if and when you do read about the history of Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, it's always centered in California, right? Or maybe New York or Hawaii. You don't really think of Asians as growing up in the middle parts of the country, but that's where my family was. And so I wanted to honor that history. And the second thing is that I don't think you can know a person's story unless you actually know the family's history, because so much about the things you value, the way you sort of look at the world, is really shaped by them. And so I just want to talk a little bit about my family before we start, okay? So, everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain. That's how my dad greeted any new face when he was in the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa, Gong Li Chin, had faced the same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young impoverished family. For here to go. For here to go, as I got older, it was a question I asked myself. Starting in our restaurant's long and open back kitchen, where my family made some of our most popular items, including the tangiest barbecue pork and best-smelling almond cookies, my mom taught me my first lessons. Before diving into math, English, and geography, she began with a little American history, tales of elders and ancestors, our family as prologue. And so that's what the prologue does. It just sort of follows my family's journey with Gong Li Chin and how he moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there weren't actually Chinese people there. Then he had to move up to Detroit. At that point, the auto industry was just starting. He tried to get a job in one of the factories, but there was a lot of discrimination that was observed in immigrants face, and so he wasn't able to get a job there. Instead, he did the hand laundry, which is one of the few opportunities available to him back then. He worked really hard and he saved up enough money to eventually open up his own laundromat. And why that is significant is because when the United States enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I believe you guys probably all know, it's the first time the U.S. ever banned a group of people from coming to the United States. There were two exceptions to that rule. One is if you were a student, and the second is if you actually owned your own business. And because he owned his own business, he was able to bring over his son and then his grandson, and that's how my family had this long history in the country. So the prologue continues. They opened up a grocery store in the 20s, and then in the 30s they opened their first restaurant, and in 1940 they opened the restaurant that I grew up in, called Chung's, and the prologue continues all the way up to the 60s. At that point we were going through the civil rights struggle in the United States. I guess we're still going through it now, but there was a lot of violence actually at that point. Detroit got hit particularly hard, buildings were burning down, people were being killed in the streets. The National Guard actually had to be called in, and they shut down the city of Detroit for 5 full days. And if you know anything about Chinese restaurants, they don't close for 5 days, right? And so, on the flip side of that is that during those 5 days, my parents were able to find time to have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. And so people sometimes ask me, oh, why do you talk about social justice so much? And I was like, well, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around. So I kind of have to do this. And so it's in my DNA. And so that's this book. It's a humorous look of looking at growing up in this wonderful Chinese restaurant in Detroit. The book came out about 2 years ago now. It's already in its 4th printing. I've done over 300 of these book talks around the world, literally everywhere from Oxford University in England to Camp Humphrey in Seoul, Korea, the largest U.S. military base. The hometown of Michigan has really, really embraced it. It's currently what's called the Great Michigan Read. Every 2 years, the state picks one book and they buy 7,000 copies and they give it away free to every school and library. I've given talks to the Ford Motor Company, the Pistons, the Lions. The Lions have actually said anytime I'm home in Detroit, I get free tickets to the game. So if you like sports, write a book. You get free tickets. So yeah, I'm happy to be here with you all, and hopefully we'll have a fun conversation tonight. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I hope to start us off with some good questions. But actually Curtis supplies me with questions, but I think that's a very difficult task because with 300 book talks, how could we really supply him, right? So I want to invite you to join us in this task. Can everyone hear me from the back? Yeah, I'm learning from your projection. If not, I need to do those exercises at home tonight. So let me try. But if you don't hear me, please interrupt anytime. So yeah, please join us. Come up with some great questions and see if we can supply Curtis today. So let's start off some questions that interest us. I want to start with the title of your book, right? I think this title really resonates with a lot of people. And as an educator and new mom, I'm interested in knowing what do you want to teach? Could we learn from your book?
Well, the one thing I will say is, I like the title too. It's actually the first thing I came up with when writing it. I was like, oh, I'm going to write this book about all the stuff I learned in Chung. But I will say that if there are other writers in the audience, choose a shorter title. It's really long to type it every time. But given the title of the book, people always ask me, what's the greatest lesson you learned? Because there were so many things, right? Like big lessons and small lessons. But the one that I always love to tell people is the one that my dad would share with me. When you're a kid growing up, oftentimes your parents would say, don't talk to strangers. My dad actually said the opposite. He said, talk to strangers. And who he was talking about were the people sitting in our dining room. Because my dad was this kid who grew up in Chinatown. He didn't know what opportunities existed outside of the 4 walls of that restaurant. He never went to college, never saw what was out of it. But he knew that he had this dining room full of people who did. And so anytime he met somebody who he thought, had a good job or just seemed really happy, he'd call all 6 of us kids to run over and barrage them with questions of, what do you do for a living? how'd you get your job? How much money do you make? You know, and it's just this idea of being able to talk to people that are different from you and not being afraid to ask questions or even asking for help if you need it. And so I feel like, you know, that was probably the greatest lesson that I learned, you know, growing up in that restaurant, just how to interact with people.
That's great. We all need to talk to each other after this talk for an hour, right?
And Todd said that too. I mean, you grew up, I mean, or you worked in a lot of restaurants. It's this idea, you met so
Yeah.
many different people.
I was a shy kid, and so it was a useful place to lose that.
Yeah, yeah.
I have a related question. What was it like growing up in a family business? And what were the sources of stress, the sources of joy?
I guess there were probably more stress than joy. You know, it's interesting because when you spend so much time with your family, I mean, I guess it's comforting when I think about it now. I mean, but it's like that's all I knew. And it wasn't just, so in my family, like in our house, you know, we had my parents, my grandparents, and my 5 siblings and me, but occasionally we would also have like cousins and second cousins. And there was this one stretch where my family took in a family of Vietnamese refugees. You know, it was like a really crowded house. And then on top of that, you know, spending all that time in the restaurant, I guess, I don't know. I don't know anything else differently. I've just always been around them, you know, and you know each other's business. And I guess that's a good and bad thing, right? You know, that familiarity. Yeah, yeah. But I look back on it very fondly now. And I miss that restaurant. We don't own the restaurant anymore. And just really, that's partly why I wrote the book, was because, you know, when my siblings started having kids, I just thought it was really sad that this next generation wouldn't know anything about this fabulous restaurant. And so it really was for them.
That's great. I think this notion of memory is very vivid and important to your book. And as Dr. Yang introduced in the beginning of this event, I'm directing with my co-PI there, Dr. San Miguel. We have a digital humanities and public history project mapping Houston's old Chinatown. I'm sorry for so much marketing, but this is the school of business, right? That's all we do. So yeah, so like if you haven't gotten like postcards, it's outside. If you want to learn more about our Chinatown project. So when I read your book, I'm really struck by the description of Chinatown, because I've never been to Detroit, I've never been to Chinatown, but somehow it really brought these vivid memories of Chinatown. And you like really paints this like vivid picture of this disappeared Chinatown, exactly what our project wants to capture. So, and your family's Chinese restaurant somehow becomes this symbolic geography of the survival of the community and the whole Chinatown as well. So can you describe how this old Chinatown plays a part in your identity and also family?
Well, I mean, Chinatown, but more specifically Chinese restaurants. I mean, they always repeat this quote that there are over 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States, which is more than the number of McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut combined. I mean, Chinese restaurants are just everywhere. And I think that they're really special places because they're one of the few where you can actually go in and see someone from a different race or religion or socioeconomic background. And as our country becomes more and more divided, I think we're going to need spaces like this, like the Chinese restaurants. The way I sort of pitched this book to my agent was like, you know, come for the egg rolls, but stay for the talk on racism. You know, because there's a lot of these really serious projects, things going on in this country, but we need to be able to talk about it in a friendlier way. And so maybe Chinese restaurants can sort of help with that. For me, growing up in that Chinatown just felt really, really safe because Detroit was really going downhill very fast in the 70s and 80s. You know, the neighborhood that we were in was the red light district. It was the highest crime rate in the city of Detroit. And so literally just like a block away, you know, people would be killed constantly. Do you know what I mean? Like store owners and stuff like that. But at the same time, this one little block of Chinatown just felt really, really safe. And that was partly because, and this is a historical thing, is that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Bachelor Society, there were a lot of old single Chinese men, right, who were literally dying out. They didn't have families, right? They didn't have anywhere to go, so they would actually be sitting outside of Chinatown all the time. So it was like almost like nonstop babysitting, you know what I mean, for us. So we could play out on the streets because, you know, there was like a couple dozen of these old Chinese men, you know, who basically provided nonstop, you know, eyes for us. Even as late as midnight at night, we could go out and play. So that's why I always felt safe and secure in that Chinatown.
I have a related question. Your shirt and your book demonstrate your abiding love for not just Chinatown, but Detroit more broadly. And so much of the book, Detroit's a powerful character. Can you talk a little bit about how Detroit changes over time? Because as a historian, one of the things I was really struck by is that you get a tremendous history of how, a tremendously human history about how a city changes over time through, you know, everything from the Reagan years to Coleman Young. And can you, what do people get wrong about Motown?
Yeah, I mean, that was a big thing when you grow up in Detroit. It's like growing up there, you just heard all these negative things about the city, like even with our family members who lived on the coast. Like whenever something bad would happen to Detroit, they'd instantly call us up and say, "Are you guys okay? Are you guys okay?" It's like this constant fear. But for us, well, I don't think we were really afraid. That's the world that we knew. And so I always understood that, you know, Detroit had a bad rap amongst people. And so when I sat down to write this book, I felt like that was one of the things I wanted to do, was also rehabilitate the image. Because as I said earlier, it's like Detroit's still capable of producing good things. I mean, I feel like I had a great childhood, despite all the violence, despite all that stuff going on. And I think one of the things that people have said about my book is that I don't flinch talking about the bad stuff in Detroit, but I do provide this alternate side, right? So you can see there's two sides of the coin all the time. And so one of the best things about this book is like, I've just had so many Detroiters just come up to me and just say, "Thank you for telling our story. Thank you for, like, you know, showing that Detroit is actually a good city." So I feel like half the time I'm like on a PR tour for the city of Detroit. You know, it's not just about selling the book. It's also about like talking up my hometown. So I'm happy to do that.
They love you in Troy as well?
Troy? I don't know if they do. You really want me to tell you a bad story?
Sure.
So this is
I like bad stories.
This is the climate that we're living in terms of stories by gay people and people of color. Is that so? When my book was about to come out, I actually reached out to my old high school and said, "Hey, would you guys like me to do an event there?" And the librarian said, "Yeah, sure." And she got all excited. She scheduled the whole all-school assembly. She picked out all the teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And like a month before the event, she's like, "Oh, let's do a second event at the rival high school," because she was also a librarian there too. And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." But then a week later, I get a phone call, an email from her saying, "I'm sorry, I can't move forward on either project." I'm like, "Why not?" And she said, "It's because you're not part of the curriculum." And I'm like, "Well, how do I get to be part of the curriculum?" And she said, "You have to talk to the assistant superintendent at that point." So it escalated really fast. And so the assistant superintendent gets onto the email chain, and she's like, "Call me, call me." And I've always been told that if someone says call you, don't call them, because it means they want to do something, you know? And so I just kept like saying, "Well, please explain to me, what is the offer? What do you want?" And eventually she just said, "Okay, you can come at 6 a.m. in the morning if you want," you know? I'm not going to wake up at 6 a.m. to show up to like 5 students, you know what I mean? So it just never happened. But that just shows you like the chilling effect of, I know you guys are in Texas, right? You guys are dealing with this issue front and center. And, you know, people are always talking about like the book bans, right? The things that grab the headline. But think about all the other soft bans that are happening, right? Where people are behind the scenes making these decisions that we never even hear about, right? Like whether it's you know, whether or not to invite someone to your campus, whether it's a bookstore saying, "Are we going to stop 1 copy of the book or 3 copies of the book?" All these small decisions add up where it becomes a really, really chilling effect right now. And it's really hard to be a writer of color, a queer writer, you know, or anybody from a marginalized community that, you know, is under attack right now because of these anti-DEI efforts. So I'll try not to get too political. I don't want you guys to get into trouble. Okay, so. Right.
Well, one of the reasons I was interested in Troy, just a follow-up, is that it's also, you're moving between the suburbs and the city. And in that movement, there's a lot of this sort of twin coming-of-age story. One about your sort of political awakening, and the other one that you're coming out.
Yeah, so when we moved from a primarily black neighborhood to a primarily white neighborhood, it was a culture shock for me, right? Because it's like I'd never been around, like the school was like 98% white and stuff like that. And so I was like, how do I get along? How do I, integrate myself into this community? And so I decided to be a young Republican, because I thought, oh, that's the best way to hang out with white people. And so I became like class president, president of the National Honor Society. I co-founded the Young Republicans, Students Against Smoking. Margaret Thatcher was my imaginary girlfriend. Like I was like a total right-winger at that time. But eventually I go off to Michigan, and college does turn you woke. So I mean that's what happens. Yeah, so it's that journey of like figuring out. At the end of the day, it's like I think the epiphany I learned in life is that we spend so much time just trying to figure out who our tribe is, like who are the people that we want to hang out with, right? But if you don't do the hard work first of understanding who you are, then you may end up hanging out with the wrong people, right? The people that maybe don't share your values, the people that don't necessarily have your best interests at heart. And so really just spending a little time focusing on yourself and what you think about the world and how you sort of see it and what kind of values you want to see promoted. And so that's something I had to do, is to learn how to look inward a little bit more.
That's great. We want to turn to the family topic. I'm particularly interested in that because I'm a mom of a 4-month-old, and I'm very interested in the role family plays in your memoir. Ning and your mom seem two very different characters.
Yeah.
Like you said, close your family, I thought were the people who loved and nurtured you. That didn't describe Ning. I didn't say that. You say that.
Yeah.
But your mom, on the other hand, seems a model mother who lives a lifetime of sacrifices for her children, a strong mother who always outlasted her opponent, and some of her expectations seem like a tiger mom, very Chinese in some way, especially when I see her mantra of obeying our elders, being quiet and working hard, but also very unique in her own ways. So can you tell us more about your mom and how she nurtured you and your siblings?
Yeah, my mom is one of the reasons I actually wrote the book, because she always wanted her story told, because she had such a tough life, and she just really, So I will actually read the excerpt from this if you don't mind, but I'll have to set this up for you all. When I was in high school, and it came time to apply for college, I actually was one of those students that was not planning to go to college, because I actually did not have a good sense of what my future might look like. As a closeted gay kid, the only time you ever saw somebody who was gay in the papers, they were in the hospital dying from AIDS, right? And then on top of that, one of our favorite customers when I was growing up was this guy who'd come in all the time by himself. He told us he was an ER doctor. Turned out he was actually a famous psychiatrist who was coming to the area to hire the prostitutes. And he was trying to break off with this one girl that the pimp got so upset that he took a baseball bat and he bashed his head in and killed him. And then he took a Ginsu knife and chopped up his body and littered it all across the freeway up to the northern peninsula. And so like with that amount of violence that I was sort of seeing, I didn't think I'd live past the age of 30. I thought I'd be dead by the age of, by the end of the decade. And so I didn't understand the value of sitting in a classroom for another four years when I just thought like, I got to go out there. I got to see the world before, I'm gone. But my mom was like this immigrant. She, got married at the age of 17, arranged marriage, never had any opportunities. She had to drop out of high school, didn't have, opportunities herself. She came to Detroit, had this terrible mother-in-law, my grandmother, and just didn't have opportunities. But through her kids, she really felt like education was the way for us to sort of get out of that Chinese restaurant. And so, she had this mantra, like you said, work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. That's all she said. Work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. And I rationalized, like, well, what would be me giving up 4 years of my life for this woman who's given up her whole life for me? And so I made a deal with her, and I said, okay, Mom, I will apply to college. but I'll only apply to one school, and if I don't get in, I'm not going. And she's like, okay, fine, apply to Michigan. And so I applied to Michigan, and sadly, I got in. I ended up going there. I was one of those kids that actually, it's called first-generation college kid, right? And so, it's a big, steep learning curve about that. But I had to work full-time, and I took classes at night, right, because I had to pay for college myself. And then, when you look through the course catalog at night, you realize there's a lot of creative writing classes, right? And so I did the math, and I said, okay, if I took poetry writing classes, and if I only wrote haikus, I could graduate in less than 500 words. And that was like my whole strategy for graduating college. So, okay. So I must have wrote a really good haiku because I got into this creative writing program at U of M, which only took 20 people. Okay, so I'm going to read a story from that. Okay? So, one thing you should know is that reading the book, it's supposed to be like a journey into a Chinese restaurant. That's why the opening line is what my dad would say, which is welcome to Chung's, and the closing line is thank you, please come again. And then all the chapters are like listed like a Chinese menu. So this is chapter N7. Okay. So, being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable as my dad asked every customer, have you met our number 3? He's the writer in the family. Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expect him to say I was the only one on campus even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance of having some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. Have you read this book? It's so good. The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old, sassy Chinese ladies who like to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could easily have been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited the most memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, "You could be the next Amy Tan." My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I'd heard growing up, but now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing how our waiters sometimes put their tips together, my mom shared an oldie. When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want us to leave her big home, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me and my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made me watch as they forced my grandma to climb the old banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass. For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, a king's ransom in people's money, to local fishermen to ferry a remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The traitor had turned us in to the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma. Another chapter came as we stood beneath a painting of the Chinese countryside. When my pawpaw and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers. Once again, she gave me a demonstration, this time bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong after she was reunited with her parents and siblings were amusing. But these were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. I sat and listened, but that was as far as it would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns. I threw down my Parker pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. You told me that story over and over, and I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke. My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. You don't want to hear my story? I tensed up. I do, but I'm behind in my own stuff. Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and saving the world, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem. My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. Her 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Detroit and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove that her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, the ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. Go ahead, Mom. I'll write it down this time. My mom bowed her head as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. No, you go on. You do your own thing. I reached out my hand, but by then she disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging walks and rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I'd done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life. It was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right, but I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. That's for my mom.
One of the things I was curious about is, reading this, it seems to be that writing a memoir with so much family history, contested ground, shared memories, is perilous. What's that experience like, making the family in some ways public?
Fortunately, I didn't think about it. I just wrote the book. But I also don't think I'm a mean, vindictive person, and I love my family, so I was probably protective of them. So that's why I don't know if I had an issue with it. The only person that maybe is just my grandmother. I know we keep picking on her, but she was kind of mean. Like, she starts off the book by calling me useless, but Mo Yong. But I do share this one story about writing about family and why you should just do it anyway, if you want. So before the book came out, you get these things called galleys, like before it's published. And so I started actually touring around to try to gin up some support for the book. And so I was actually in Austin doing one of these pre-readings. And, the very next morning, the organizers were like, do you want to have breakfast with us? And I'm saying, yeah, sure. And so I called the Uber, and I go downstairs on the street to wait for the car to show up. And standing on the street corner is this old Chinese lady. And she turns around, and she sees that I'm wearing this shirt. And she's like, oh, are you from Detroit? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, I'm from Detroit. And it turned out that her mom was best friends with my grandmother. And she started saying, like, oh, your grandmother was the nicest person ever. She always had candy in her pocket. Like, she taught me how to drink American coffee. And like I'm not trying to convince her of her memories, because I wouldn't want my grandmother to go through life unloved. So it's like, it just wasn't going to be for me. So I was like, okay, fine. But when the car came, I jumped in the Uber and I left. But a couple days later, I realized that was probably my grandmother sending an emissary from the grave saying, how dare you write that shit about me? You better change it now before the book comes out. And so the moral of that tale is that even if your family's dead and buried, they're not going to like what you write about them anyway, so you might as well do it anyway. But I will say that it's actually brought my family closer together. I mean, for my mom, who's had such a tough life, so sadly my dad died in a car accident, and my mom was severely injured, and so she's never really fully recovered. But she lives in California now, but she gets all these phone calls from all her friends back in Detroit whenever I'm back there and I'm on TV or there's a news board. So that's, given her some life, and that's made me feel really, really good. There was also some schism in our family between 2 of the brothers who don't get along. and they haven't talked in 15 years, but then, at one of the readings, my nephew, who I haven't seen in 15 years, because inevitably when two siblings fight, they make people pick sides, you know what I mean? And so my nephew showed up, like for the first time, and I hadn't seen him in 15 years, so there's been nothing but upside in terms of writing the family story, so yeah, just feel very blessed that it's happened.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about your writing and language, since we might have students and faculty here that are interested in like creative writing. Your memoir joins like a corpus of Chinese American literature. Do you see it distinctively Chinese American or more like American coming of age American story?
I don't know. I mean, if anything, I thought of my book as a Midwestern story, because I really like the fact that my book has been embraced by my home city of Michigan. Like in addition to this Great Michigan Read, I've just been constantly going back, like every 3 months, doing readings at every library, every nonprofit. I'll be doing that for the next year through this Great Michigan Read program. And I just always feel like a Midwesterner more so than that. I mean, it's very Asian American, it's very gay, but at the heart of it, I feel like I'm a Midwesterner, and so I really want the book to be embraced as such, that geography of that space.
Yeah, that's great. And from your memoir, we can see a fluidity between Chinese and Chinese American cultures. And we have a campus filled with like diverse student population, as you see in the audience here, and that's something we are very proud of. And how would you respond to young people who struggle between two cultures or more, and especially when they don't speak their parents' languages?
Well, you can correct me if I'm wrong because you're the academic, but one of the things that people have said about my book in terms of looking at other Asian American literature is that I actually don't have that struggle. I don't go through this idea of like, am I Asian or am I American? Because my family's been here such a long time, I embrace both sides already. I understand I'm Asian American, it includes both sides. What I struggle with is being Asian American, where do I fit into this world of black and white? Right? That's my struggle. It's like, I understand who I am as an Asian American, right? I'm fully accepting of it. But where that fits me into this larger narrative of America is where I struggle with, right? And I think that is a difference between a lot of these other, more immigrant stories where it's like you have this notion of like, well, how much am I from that previous culture and how much? I understand it's both. So, I mean, in that sense, I don't. But what has been interesting for me in terms of writing this book is that because I've grown up very comfortably as Asian American, it's because of, like growing up in that Chinatown, which had a lot of Chinese, but also Indians and Filipinos, But then even when we moved to the white neighborhood, there were like, out of the 400 kids in our graduating class, there was like 8 Asians, 2 black kids, and 2 Latinos. But out of the 8 Asian kids, we were all friends. But that's maybe because we all took the same advanced math and science courses, but we all hung out. So I grew up watching Bollywood films, and I grew up going to my friend's Korean church. So like I have a, awareness of this idea of being Asian American, But what's been different though is writing this book, which has this word Chinese in the title, because I've never really felt Chinese. I feel Asian, but not Chinese. But now that I've traveled around the world, I've been approached by so many people from the Chinese diaspora who come up to me and say, oh, your experience is just like my experience in Suriname or Mauritius or Belgium. And so now I understand that I'm also part of this thing called the Chinese diaspora, which is giving me this access of like a different way of thinking about myself. Like I don't think I could ever think of myself as being Chinese, because I don't speak the language, I don't have any relatives there anymore, I don't have any strong sense of it. But I do feel like I have an affinity with other Chinese people who have left China, right? I feel like I can access that,
Yeah. So you move very fluidly, like between these cultures, but also the genres that you're dealing with. Like you're a filmmaker, you're an activist, but also a memoir writer. So how do you see, like, for instance, like how does your visual storytelling differ from like writing memoir?
Well, the visual storytelling is I've been telling other people's stories, right? Like when I make films or when I was writing for TV, it was always like somebody else, and you'd get assignments and stuff like that. So writing the memoir is actually the first time I'm talking about myself, which is kind of, it's different, right? Like, because we're not you're not necessarily comfortable with that. But Yeah, it's been a learning lesson, putting myself out there. But I feel like, I guess, I mean, I'm older now, so I feel like I've learned some things that I'm okay sharing it. I don't know if I could have written a book about myself like in my 20s or 30s, but I'm in my 50s now, so hopefully I've learned a few things, right?
Yeah. That's something very admirable in your memoir too. You really don't shy away from these difficult conversations like racism, sexuality, and class. But it's also filled with humor and love. Like you deal with it in such a interesting and humorous way.
If you can't laugh at yourself, then you have no point in writing a memoir. I mean, you really have to be able to have a good nature, because it's like this stuff happened 30, 40 years ago. If I haven't changed and become a better person, hopefully, then what's the point, right? Like, I'm no longer a Republican. You know what I mean? So, sorry.
I'd wondered.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to get you guys into trouble. Sorry. But so, if you can't look back on these times and see how you've grown as a person, then how are other people also going to learn from you too if you don't take that approach? So I think that's why it's okay for me to actually talk about the negative stuff. Or like the story that I read where I was a total jerk to my mom. You know what I mean? Like, I feel bad about it, and sometimes I still even get emotional thinking about like how much I hurt her, during those years where I was just kind of but that's something we all go through, right? When you're at 18 in your 20s, you're trying to define yourself, and when you have a parent that wants to live through you, right? Who puts so much of their stock in their life, it's a lot of pressure, and so I wasn't a nice son to my mom, but now that I've written a book, I get points for that, so it actually works out. So now I am a good son, because of that. So. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up question? One of the moments of trauma, of violence that really struck me in the book is when you talked about your experience and your family's experience of when Vincent Chin was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And you've made a movie about that as well. Can you talk a little bit because seems like a pivot point in your own political and personal journey and the way you viewed yourself as an American.
Yeah. Does anybody here not know the Vincent Chin story? Okay. Okay, cool. Because I always like to get a sense of how well this story still holds up and stuff like that. But this isn't the 80s. The auto industry was really struggling in Detroit, which led to a lot of anti-Asian sentiment because of the Japanese car companies that had overtaken the U.S. automakers. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He goes to the strip club, and these two white auto workers come in at some point, and they're overheard saying, "It's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work." They're all kicked out of the bar, and then these two guys get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit trying to find Vincent, and they sadly find him sitting outside of McDonald's, and they also take a baseball bat out of their car and they bash his head in. And so I'm 14 years old at this time. I'm about to enter high school, and we found out that very next morning because my uncle was his best man. And when you know somebody that's like in the hospital, like fighting for their life like that, you're gonna want to see what the news is saying, right? So I checked the papers, checked the TV, I checked the radio. Nobody covered it. So I checked the next day. Nobody covered it again. I checked the next day. Nobody covered it. I checked again and again and again. I checked for 12 whole days. Nobody in the mainstream media covered that story. Meanwhile, all this stuff was happening. Like the family had to pull the plug. They had to cancel the wedding. All this stuff, and everybody in our community was coming to our restaurant trying to find out information. I mean, they were also coming to our restaurant because we had the gambling den in our basement, but that's like another story. But so, like, that idea of what the mainstream media covered and what our community cared about really stuck out at me, because several months later, when the judge came back with the sentence, his sentence was $3,000 fine and not a single day in jail. And his rationale was, you don't put these type of people in jail, like white middle-class people with jobs. And, I don't have a problem that the judge showed compassion for these guys because, we're Buddhists, right? So we're taught to be compassionate about things. Because I'm sure they didn't mean to kill someone at the beginning of their day. But I think the problem is that the judge had no compassion for Vincent and what his family was going through. The mom who'd just been widowed, the fiance, and I think that was the problem. But at the same time, when I thought about it, it kind of made sense to me because for the last couple years, all the media in Detroit had been writing these stories about the white auto workers and how they were losing their homes and losing their jobs. And so there was all this built-in sympathy for these guys already. But there was no stories about like how Asian Americans were struggling or having difficulties. And so for me, that's when this recognition of like, you know, we have to tell our stories, right? We have to be able to get people to know who we are before these terrible crimes happen, right? Because they will continue to happen, but we've got to get ahead of it. And so what I did as a 14-year-old was I lugged the typewriter. Do you know what typewriters are? Those things? Yeah. So,
I do.
Okay, you do. I don't know, do you know what it is? Okay, so I lugged the typewriter into the dining room, and I just started writing these letters to the editor saying, hey, why are you guys not covering this story? And one of my first lessons that I learned politically came from the mayor that you mentioned, Mayor Coleman Young, who was one of our regular customers. He's a really famous character. This, you know, his nickname, excuse me, his nickname for himself was Motherfucker in Charge. That tells you a little bit about himself. So anyway, he saw me typing back there, and you know, I was like, my dad, who's like this guy who's always causing trouble and stuff like that. My dad is like, you know, Coleman Young said, what are you doing back there? And my dad's like, oh, he's writing these angry letters, right? And I'm like, you know, because we're Buddhists, we're not supposed to be angry, right? So I'm like, no, they're just nice little letters, just whatever. And then Coleman Young actually said to me, it's okay to be angry. You know, sometimes you need anger to sort of get things done, like on a civil rights letter. And he said, you have to understand what makes you angry in life, and then you've got to figure out, like, what are you going to do to fix it? Do you know what I mean? And so for me, it's just this idea of, like, you know, the case was very, very important, but it's also this idea that in that restaurant, I learned all these different ways of sort of approaching situations, you know, in life, personally, but civil rights and all this stuff. Because we had such a diverse clientele, I got to hear these different perspectives on how to approach these things, you know, and you know, people have different ways of doing it, and sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's from different communities based off of it. But because we had such a diverse group, I was exposed to all these different thoughts, which really, I think, opened up a lot for me.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a restaurant question. I had a different restaurant question, but this is one
Okay.
that struck me as we were walking over. Of course, we focus on the Chinese restaurant that you grew up in, but what did you learn from working at Drake's when you were in college? Because that occupies a big part of the second half of the book. And
Yeah. So when I went off to college, my first job was working in an office, you know, or at the dorms, really, and I just didn't like working behind a desk, and so I had to quit and work. I realized that I have to be on my feet because that's who I am. Like, I have to do food service because that's what I grew up in. And so I got a job working at one of the classic restaurants on campus, a diner that had been like opened in like the 1920s and stuff like that. And that was sort of, you know, an eye-opening place too, because if I compare the University of Michigan and the big buildings there versus this little, you know, sandwich shop, in many ways, I probably learned more in that sandwich shop than, you know, in, you know, no offense to colleges and your professors. I'm sure you guys are all very excellent at teaching what you guys teach. But there's also this other world where you can actually learn things, where you pick up things. And, you know, for me, at least on the idea of sexuality, I definitely, because I don't even think, did we even have LGBT classes back then? You know, if we did, I never signed up for one. But I did learn about that stuff working at this sandwich shop, because it's very, you know, bohemian, very artsy, very progressive, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, you know, again, no offense to universities, but I do feel like I learned so much more, you know, working in restaurants, you know, in my life. Because, you know, you learn about people, which is probably the most important thing.
I felt like in reading it, you found your tribe there.
Yeah.
To a certain extent.
Yeah, definitely. You know, my political identity, my sexual identity, you know, my friends. Yeah, it was good. It was a good place.
Yeah. And you also weave your food or feast into the structure of your book, like, you know, appetizer, main dish, and like fortune cookies. Like, how do you really categorize, like, which part is which?
I just want to have fun with the book, so there are all these little Easter eggs about that kind of stuff. And, you know, definitely writing about food is always fun, you know. And it is really true that I said, you know, for every occasion, whether it was a happy, sad, you know, my family had a dish for it, right? Like, food was the answer to everything. You know, and because we were a family that was working class, we didn't have a lot of money, But the one thing that my parents always made sure we had was food, and they never complained when we wanted to eat anything, right? They said, eat whatever you want in this restaurant. Of course, my grandmother hated it. She'd be like, stop eating the lobster. You know what I mean? Like, you know, but, you know, my parents are not like that. They wanted to know that we could have whatever we wanted, at least when it came to food. And that generosity was just really, very kind, you know what I mean, of my parents. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know that we have so many questions that we are eating away your dinner time. So we'll open up the floor, but my last question to you is like, what dish actually represents your life, your spirits the most, if you were to choose one?
I can't. That's like choosing your favorite kid. Like, oh my God. So like even when you just asked that question, like 10 different dishes popped into my head. I can't, sorry. There's a dish in our dish, almond boneless chicken, which is a Detroit dish, is in there. But I also like a good basic beef and mushroom. I eat a lot of noodle dishes. It's just too much, you know. I always said that my dream life would be living above a Chinese restaurant overlooking a canal. That's just my, you know, I just like water, so it's like, yeah, that would be my dream life, but yeah.
Thank you so much for giving us so much food for thought. And I think now it's time for the audience to...
I love all your food puns. I know you keep sneaking them in. We can do questions, but one thing that I do at every reading I've done over 300 of these now, is I do a selfie. So can we do that quickly before? Okay, thanks everybody. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Questions from the audience? Dr. Ramos.
Dr. Ramos.
Hi, thank you for reading and for speaking about your experience. I feel like it must be, we're about the same age. And when I think back to the 80s, now we're accustomed to say the 1900s, that it seems like a different, like you're translating the past in some ways when you're writing about it in the present. And I mean, I'm also a historian, so, but when it's something you've lived through, it seems hard to kind of square away. I don't, you spoke about the Vincent Chin story, and I remember when Renee Tijima-Pena's documentary came out, and it was just so difficult. And I think back, and the thing that seemed to resonate the most at that time for me was that, you know, there was no distinguishing Japanese or Chinese, and I'm wondering if that's changed. I mean, in our current time, there is there still a flattening of, like, for not in the non-Asian perception of Asian culture? Are we at a different point, or is it just the same but takes a different form?
I think you'd have to ask non-Asians, because I don't know. I could say for myself, like being Asian American, I think that at least amongst the people that I know, I think there's less concern about that kind of stuff. I mean, there is an understanding that you can do both. You can be Asian American, but then you can be your own individual ethnicity too, you know, when that calls for. You know, yeah, you can wear multiple hats about it. So I'm trying to think of what else I could say to that point. You know, but thinking back on it, it was a really, really different time period because the communities were so small back then, right? But now it's such a bigger community and there's larger segments. I mean, really back then it was just the largest groups were like the Chinese, Filipinos, and Japanese, right? But now the 6 largest groups, I think, you know, Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese are like 6th, right? So there's been some shifting and changing in the demographics of the community, but I think it's a stronger community now, you know, and I don't like have an issue with that mistaken identity and stuff like that. If someone calls me like Korean or whatever, I don't get upset, you know what I mean? So.
Yeah, it seems like there was a big reaction for the murders in Atlanta. I think it was 4 years
You mean like a unified response?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this is what I say about like discrimination is that the attitudes about my great-great-great-grandfather when he came over are oftentimes the same ways that people might look at me. Like you're a foreigner, you know, you have diseases, we can't assimilate you. Those stereotypes have not changed, right? It's pretty consistent. But what gives me hope is sort of looking at how our community has changed, even between back then and looking at the Vincent Chin case, right? Because the Vincent Chin case, you can actually say is a failure because those guys never served a single day in jail, right? We never got justice for Vincent. But when you look at a case like the Atlanta shooting or the Indianapolis shooting or the Sikh temple, I mean, you know, our community is much stronger now. We can push back. And so that's where I sort of focus on, you know, in the sense of, you know, back then, you know, there were no Asian Americans in the media who could keep the story or who wanted to report about it, right? There were no Asian American politicians that could advance legislation. There were no Asian American nonprofits to sort of like do victim advocacy. You didn't have social media with Asian American celebrities who keep these stories alive. You now have Asian American business leaders who are funding these things through through foundations and stuff like that. So if you just look across the board, it's like, you know, as a community, we're much stronger, like in terms of responding back to these things. And I feel like that's the thing that I sort of focus on, you know, because sadly, when you live in a multicultural society, there is going to be misunderstanding, right? There is going to be racism. There's going to be gender, you know, discrimination, homophobia, all that stuff. Because we come from different backgrounds, we have different values. There's inevitably going to be some clashing because of that. But the question is, like, we as the Asian American community, are we prepared to meet that moment to sort of push back and sort of, you know, stand our ground? And I think in that sense, I do have a lot more confidence. Mm-hmm.
I was curious that, like, now that you've done a lot of book signing and some touring, if you had any thoughts about, like, the differences between Chinese restaurants among diaspora in different places, and if that, like, has furthered your thoughts on how the Asian American experience in Detroit differed from other places.
Yeah, Detroit has the best Chinese food. That's all I know. You know, one of the things I did, like, so after I did about 100 events, about 200 events, you know, you get sick and tired of talking about yourself. And so what I did was I did a subset of book talks where I did 30 talks in Chinese restaurants across the United States. And instead of talking about my book, I actually invited the owner of the restaurant to come up, and I would interview them about how they got started, what are the challenges they are. And those are probably the most fun events. And it is interesting, like the challenges that they're all facing right now, right? Because COVID, a lot of restaurants in general are having difficulty, but because of the anti-Asian racism, I think some of these had even more difficulty. You know, the cost of running a restaurant has been really, really difficult. But the number one issue that people said in terms of you know, the sustainability of these Chinese restaurants is actually successorship. You know, because a lot of the parents tell their kids to move on. They don't want them working in the restaurant, and so they have nobody to take over. And so even within the last, you know, 2-3 years, many of the oldest Chinese restaurants in America have closed. The oldest one in San Francisco, the oldest one in St. Louis. My family was the oldest one in Detroit left. They just closed earlier this year because the matriarch died at the age of 94. So I think that's a bigger issue that I've been sort of looking at in terms of Chinese restaurants and their legacy. But in terms of the question of, do I notice a regional difference or what? Or
Yeah, it's like, do you notice a cultural shift in how diaspora, like, engages with the community through food?
Yeah, no, definitely. So one of the projects that I was starting before this anti-DEI effort that's going on right now was I was starting to raise funds for a 6-part docuseries on the history of Chinese restaurants in America, because you can actually chart the immigration patterns as well as geopolitical, larger international geopolitics through the type of Chinese food available in America. So when you look at that first wave, which my family's part of, it was the Southern Chinese, the poor people, you know, like the hillbillies, right? That was us. We did the railroads and all that kind of stuff. That was Cantonese food. Then you saw the shift, you know, during World War II, right? What happened? A bunch of people who came from Taiwan, but they're originally from Hunan and Sichuan, right? came to the United States, and they brought their food, right? And then in '65, when the immigration law changed, right, the Hart-Celler Act, suddenly you saw Shanghainese food. And then when Richard Nixon went to China, you suddenly saw Beijing food. And what's happened now, and this is what I find very, very interesting, is that because of geopolitics and the rise of Asian countries and their economies, you actually see a bunch of high-end, Asian chains coming in, and even low-end. Well, I was going to say Jollibee, but I don't want to say like that's a low-end thing. But the idea of just Asia being able to export their culture to America, because America's always had this soft power, right, sending over McDonald's and everything else. What does that say, now that Asian countries also have that ability to come and have this influence through their food, right? Like Din Tai Fung and Hai Dai Lao and all these places. I think you guys probably have them around here too, right? And so I think that's the interesting thing of like how we can measure a country's power and influence, through food and the availability of food and how people perceive it. Does that necessarily lead to less racism or things like that? I don't know. It provides an opening for these things, but I don't know if it's necessarily a cure, but at least it provides an opening, I think. So.
You should write a little bit about your dad responding to the changing tastes around some of those.
My dad, he sprinkled in a couple of things, because he was trying to adapt. That's one of the things about Chinese restaurants is that they are very, very flexible. I think that when I think about Chinese food and Chinese restaurants in general, I'm very proud of that history because Chinese restaurants really have, in a lot of ways, shaped the way that we eat food in general, right? Like, who pioneered takeout? Chinese people did, right? Who pioneered this idea of open concept kitchens, right? Because people used to say we cook dogs and rats. We had to open up so that restaurants, so you can see what people are eating. Even those stupid little menus that get slipped under your door. That was us too. Like everything, like the way. But the biggest is probably custom ordering because the way Chinese food is made, it's very easy for you to walk into a restaurant and say, oh, put in extra da-da-da-da. Traditionally, the older restaurants, when restaurants were first starting in the U.S., they didn't do that. You had like a set menu. This is what you eat, right? And the other thing too is that the first restaurants that became popular were Chinese restaurants because as soon as middle-class people started being able to go out to eat, they're not going to go out to eat the stuff that their mom and dad cook at home. They're going to go out to eat the most exotic, different thing that they couldn't get. And so we think about Chinese restaurants in terms of how they've shaped America and the way we eat. It's like I take a lot of credit for that, And as I talked about earlier, it's like, Chinese restaurants are one of the few places where you can go see a diverse group of people. And so the thing that I say now is like Chinese restaurants are going to save America. You know what I mean? They're going to bring us all together. We're going to have the table. We're going to serve the food, and we're going to bring Americans together. That's the legacy of Chinese restaurants.
So you mentioned at the beginning and I did the mental math, and it really does seem like you kind of came to an age at the height of that. And I think for a lot of younger gay people, we only hear not even necessarily stories, but echoes. You see images of choir teams where 3 of them are wearing red and the rest are wearing black because that's how many died. So there's not a lot of chances to hear stories from people who went through that. So I want to know, what's your experience with that?
I'm actually working on my next memoir this book ends in the year 1990 and when I graduate, and then I move off to New York to become an AIDS activist. But it is true that I am part of it, but in some ways I'm sort of the tail end of some of those lead activists, like ACT UP, some really famous stuff that happened in '89. So I just came right after it, but I would have to say that, in some ways, I was part of that because I grew up with that legacy and that fear of, dying. But at the same time, because I was in Michigan, and I sometimes credit my parents for saving me because if when I graduated high school in '86, I thought I would move to New York or San Francisco, right? And if I had done that, there's a higher chance that I could have been infected versus my parents making me go to Ann Arbor where infection rates were really low and almost safe. And plus the fact that my older brother was living in the same dorm meant I wasn't doing anything, So that kept me safe, and in some ways, I do credit my parents for, in some ways, saving my life in that way, because I wasn't in it. And I wasn't one of those people that, I knew people that died when I moved to New York, but they were never my closest friends, you know what I mean, in my inner circle. Because by the time you get to the year 1990, there was enough awareness of like what to do and not to do. Plus there was AZT that had just come on. We hadn't gotten to the protease inhibitors and the cocktails, but that was only about 3 years into it. So yes, I am part of that generation, but but I'm not of that generation that bore the worst of it, right? I feel like those people are the ones who are maybe a couple years older than me. Yeah. So.
Karen had her hands up early.
Hi. Yeah, something you said that really stood out to me is your emphasis on journalism and stories and media coverage. The fact that this can create empathy, but also the lack of them can also take away the empathy that you might have had for someone else, just because you don't have the opportunity to build that sort of understanding. I did want to ask, like, we're the next generation of Asian American or Chinese American storytellers and journalists. What can we do better?
What can who do better? You guys or just society? Is that the question?
Yes, specifically journalists.
Journalists.
What can you do better to cover the community? Is that what you're asking? I don't know. There's a lot of changes within that world. And God, particularly in the last year, it's been really chilling. A lot of people losing their jobs and stuff like that. Before, it seemed like they were mostly economic reasons. Like you'd go to a journalist conference and like half the panels were like, how to find a new job. You know what I mean? But it just seemed like a lot of the firings in the last year have been more editorially focused, right? Like there's a push. I mean, I know that, NBC News used to have devoted desks for the Asian American community, the LGBT community. Those people were all fired like about a month ago. And then CBS just did that like I think a week ago or so. So, that coverage is going to be more sorely lacking from those mainstream places. So the question is what's going to replace it, right? Like how do you have this, I guess it's citizen journalism to some degree, right? And you're going to have to be a little more freelance about these things and covering these stories. It will be challenging times, but unfortunately, I mean, democracies really depend on journalism. I mean, they're the front line, I think, right? So yeah, it's kind of a scary time with all these billionaires buying up the mainstream media. So I don't know what to say about that. Sorry, Except good luck.
Since I haven't read the book, I'm not sure
What?
it deals with. But what can you tell us about the food itself? And more particularly, if it's not covered in the book, maybe you could talk about your experience. To what extent or how has living in the United States impacted Chinese food? For example, is there an Americanization of Chinese food like there is in Mexican food? People talk about Mexican food and then they talk about Tex-Mex food, the Americanized version of Mexican food. Is there something similar that has gone on in Chinese food?
Well, there's this whole debate of what is authentic Chinese food, which I think is total bullshit because, like, what is authentic food? I mean, because even Chinese food in China is changing, right? Like the things we think of as traditional dishes, some of them aren't even that old. Like Peking duck, right? It's only, what 1,000 years old or something? Yeah. Like it's not super old, compared to the long history of Chinese food, you know what I mean? So things change all the time. Even dan tat, that's only and it's not even Chinese, it's Portuguese, So these things change all the time. And I always like to say, the food that we serve in Detroit, is authentic Chinese. I mean, it is Chinese food, right? It's a long lost province of China in Detroit because the way we cook that Chinese food is the same way, right? Because we use the wok, we use the idea of pre-cutting everything. We use the same, philosophies of wok mei and stuff like that. What changed a little bit was maybe some of the ingredients. It's adaptability, making sure that the customers are happy. But that is also a hallmark of Chinese food, right? Which is it's very fluid, right? Because of the way it's made. So I don't engage in those debates. I feel like the Chinese American food should stand side by side with, like Hunan and Cantonese as all these different regional types of Chinese food. So, do you agree with that?
Somewhat.
I think we're gonna fight later.
Dinner's gonna be interesting.
Hi.
Hello, sir. What advices do you have for the new college students? What advice with all your experience, with all the things that you
It depends. What do you want to do? You're just asking for life experiences? I mean, advice? I mean, usually people ask me about how to have a writing career or a filmmaking career. I can share that advice. I mean, if you want. Would that help you or not?
the things that, well, I'm an international student,
Mhm.
to Spanish at the same time. Grew up here between two cultures that I have in my life. In my life, being in the U.S., the whole system is very different. Like, I'm trying to get an idea of what my Asian life was before and advices because it's hard.
Because you want to stay here and you feel like there's some extra challenges now? I'm trying to get a...
Just extra challenges because culture is highly different.
I mean, for me, I've always thought of this idea, like, and this relates to this idea of what does it mean to be Asian American, right? Because there's some people who actually resist that term because they're like, I don't know what that means. Like, oftentimes it's like, well, I'm this specific ethnicity, or it doesn't make sense that you're lumping all these groups together. But I actually try to look at it as a positive thing and saying, well, if there's this term and people don't know what it means, then I have an ability to help shape that, right? So I can shape the idea of what does it mean to be Asian American. And I think that for yourself and for anybody in the room, it's like, you do have these abilities. Life is not static. There are things that have been established beforehand, but they change all the time, right? And so I think that if you're just, again, I guess it relates to this idea of understanding who you are and what you want to do. I can say this for a couple things, like, I don't know how this relates to it, but, being a writer, like I've had to work in different genres, right? Like I make movies, I wrote journalism pieces, I produce podcast episodes, now I write a book, I travel around and talk. And people have asked me, well, how do you navigate that, right? When you have all these different things that you have to navigate, genres. And I say, it doesn't bother me because at the end of the day, that stuff you can learn, but the one thing that you really have to get a handle on is what is your voice? Who are you? What is your perspective on the world? Because once you figure that out, you will have people coming to you, because they know what to do. Like my most recent film that I just made for PBS, which is actually premiering in New York City this Saturday at a big film festival, they approached me about it, right? Because they know who I am, they know what I like to talk about, they know what my vision is. So that's what I would just say for you as a general thing, even if you're not going to work in the creative arts, is like know who you are, know what your values are, and then, I think that you will find a position that will match that, but then more importantly, people will come to you. Do you know what I mean? Like you won't always have to search out for opportunities for yourself, because if you really establish who you are, people will come to you too. I think. At least I hope. Yeah. Does that help? I'm not... Okay. All right, thanks.
Question over here.
No.
I have one question. Where in the Chinese restaurant, were there any urban Detroit dishes and Chinese fusion dishes like Detroit pizza, Shaolin?
Yeah, almond boneless chicken. Almond boneless chicken. That's the dish. It's basically a fillet of white chicken meat, deep fried, and put over a bed of iceberg lettuce, and then ladled with a rich Asian gravy, brown gravy, and then crushed almonds on top, along with slivers of mushrooms and pea pods. And it's a really, really popular dish. And it's kind of cool because in the book, my grandmother said she invented it. And so when America's Test Kitchen, it's a show on PBS, read the book, they said, oh, prove it. So they actually hired me to do a podcast episode proving whether or not my family invented that dish. And I couldn't pinpoint it, right? because I could go back to some of our, because we have menus from the 30s, right? But that doesn't necessarily prove that we invented it. But what I was able to prove was when did the dish take off in Detroit? And the historical significance is that it took off in the 60s, because that's when it appeared on other people's menus. It didn't appear on other people's menus until then. And what happened specifically was that due to white flight, a lot of American cities were destroying neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods, to build these freeways so that people could get their jobs from the suburbs to downtown. And so in Detroit, they destroyed both Chinatown and what's called Paradise Valley, Black Bottom, the black neighborhood. And so when that happened, both of those communities had to move, and for the first time, they moved into the Cass Corridor together. And so basically what almond boneless chicken is, it's a variation of a traditional Chinese dish called wasio ap, almond pressed duck, right? But they just changed it to a meat that more, non-Chinese people would eat, right? And it's also like very southern because it's a fried thing. And so it's actually, I make the case that it's a fusion dish between African American, black culture, and Chinese culture, as to why it really took off. And so yeah, but I think that like all Chinese restaurants, they do try to be responsive to the communities that they're part of. So, a lot of fried food because there's a lot of Southerners in Detroit. Are you going to go to Detroit now just to try it?
Yes.
Yeah. The fear that that it's just a consumer.
That is what I think is more widely.
I've never heard that before. I've heard the argument that the term Asian American is strictly political and it holds no validity beyond that. I don't necessarily believe that because even if I just think of myself, my family, it's a cultural thing because I have, I'm married to a Korean, I have relatives that are, my cousins and my siblings have married every different group, like Vietnamese, Indian, Filipino. So my family is, like Asian American. So when I go home for Christmas, it's like, it's Asian American. So I think that, so for me, that's why I've always felt like there is, a natural development to it. I don't think it's just commercial or political, and I think that's okay. And I think it's just something that we do in America anyway, right? Because when you look at all these other groups that are lumped together, white people are not all the same. They're all from these different cultures in Europe, right? Latinos are not all the same. Black people are not all the same. Even Christians are not all the same, right? They're all these things, but it's what you do in America, right? Like you get together with the people that you're most similar with, and you form a community. And eventually, it's not necessarily what Asian American means right now, but it's also a question of what does Asian American mean 20 years from now? What does Asian American mean 40 years from now? And also, I'm also open to the idea that maybe these terms may not be as relevant, particularly as we move more towards globalization, right? But they're the terms that we have now, and that they work. That's good for me now. But if they change, I'm also open to that too. I'm not one of these people, who's gonna die on a hill for it. But maybe it's because I'm a writer and I understand that words are malleable, right? And they change all the time, the definitions. But again, for me right now, in the year 2025, it's a very useful term,
I'm sorry that we run out of time for more questions, but I'm sure Curtis will be around for more
Thank
questions
you.
and autographs.
I'll go out there and sign books.
Yeah, we'll have Dr. Yang for closing remarks.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. I have several thank yous to give. Thank you to Curtis Chin, thank you to Dr. Melody Lee, and thank you to Dr. Todd Romero and our audience for producing such a wonderful conversation tonight. Thank you to our Dean, Dan O'Connor, who makes everything happen in class and with class. Sorry, pun intended, I guess. I would also like to give special thanks to Iggy Harrison and his team at UH Streaming Media for their help in recording the panel. In addition, I would like to thank all of our wonderful students in Center for Public History, Daniel Killian, who's our former CPH research assistant, as well as our current research assistant, Michael Boggs, and students from the Houston History Magazine, Joaquin Davila, Anna Parker, and Avion Robinson for their fabulous help tonight. To find out more about our upcoming events, scholarships or work-study opportunities and the latest issues of Houston History Magazine and our podcast, please visit our website, uh.edu/class/CPH. And if you have a book and you want to get it signed, Curtis is going to stay seated here, and if you'll line up and come down, that way he has a table on which he can sign. So bring the books down to get them signed, and be safe.